Welcome to this hopefully relatively brief pop-up edition of my virtual weather office hours. Today's is, as I think everybody who's joining is probably aware, focused on the pair of very significant storms that will likely affect California over the next 3 or 4 days. They would be pretty significant in their own right, worthy of some considerable real time discussion, but their effect is going to be amplified also by the fact they're occurring during a peak travel period. So there will be a lot of disruption, hopefully not too much destruction, but there is the potential for some fairly serious flooding in Southern California, and also the potential for some notable wind damage in some parts of Northern California. And then finally, something I don't want to forget to talk about today, there is a legitimate chance of a rare severe thunderstorm outbreak between now and Thursday, really in 2 or maybe 3 different waves. And this is not just in Southern or Northern California, but it may affect different parts of the entire state. So that is very unusual aspect of the situation as well, but the main risk to people is most likely to come from the Southern California flash flood risk, debris flow risk, mudslide risk. The amount of rain that's going to fall overall, if you add it up over a few days, won't be unprecedented in Southern California. But that's not really the problem. The problem is how quickly the rain that does fall is going to occur. So we're talking rainfall of over 1 inch per hour at the peak of the storm in Southern California, locally more than 1.5 inches per hour. That is enough to cause flash flooding anywhere, even outside of the mountains and the debris flow corridors or recent wildfire burn areas. So this is a significant concern. And so even if you, in some parts of LA Basin, it is possible that when all is said and done that quote unquote only 2 or 3 inches of rain falls in some parts of the lowlands, but those 2 or 3 inches may fall over just a few hours, and so that could result in widespread urban inundation of streets, highways, and freeways as well. In the mountains, of course, it's a very different story. We very will likely see over 10 inches of rain, maybe upwards of a foot in some areas, in the transverse ranges above LA, Ventura, and Santa Barbara. And this too could pose major problems because, again, these are not unprecedented numbers for this part of the state, which is susceptible to extremely heavy precipitation in precisely these sorts of situations, but how quickly that it will fall. The transverse ranges could well see multiple hours with precipitation exceeding 1 or even 2 inches per hour, so it is that rate. These faster responding watersheds, not the big rivers. We're not going to see a big flood on the Sacramento River or the San Joaquin River from this kind of system. But we very well could see the creeks and streams and the smaller rivers in Southern California respond very rapidly and potentially reach levels we haven't seen in a long time. That's in addition to the debris flow and the mudslides that actually might be more disruptive in some places and in some neighborhoods. So the big threat in Southern California is related to rain, and it may include a significant portion of the LA metro area. Mostly the northern half of the LA metro. That's the higher elevation part of the metro and places that are more intermixed with the mountains, the suburbs and the freeways and the highways that go into the hills and mountains, more so than the coastal plain. But again, during the peak of the storm, there will likely be street and highway flooding everywhere in Southern California. So that's the Southern California threat. Up in Northern California, this will also be a very strong storm, but for somewhat different reasons. Fortunately, given how much rain fell from the somewhat gradual but cumulatively very substantive atmospheric river that dropped over a foot of rain in some of the Northern California locations, including at high mountain elevations that usually see snow this time of year, this will not be an exceptional precipitation event, anywhere from an inch or two to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 inches in some of the wetter spots, which is not that unusual for December in Northern California. But here, the big story is going to be really 3 different things. Number 1 is wind, and there is growing potential for a significant locally damaging windstorm in Northern California, although that's the most uncertain part of this system. I'll talk a bit more about that. The second is the possibility of a severe thunderstorm outbreak affecting much of the California coast, all the way from the north coast south to the Southern California coast. So somewhat unusually, this won't be confined to a particular segment of coast, but actually could affect essentially the entire coastline. So San Francisco Bay Area, the North Coast, the LA area, the Central Coast, and then separately portions of the Central Valley tomorrow afternoon as well. And in these locations, the main risk will probably be related to very heavy downpours and the risk for some local flash flooding even outside of Southern California, where and when those do occur, especially if they occur on saturated soils in Northern California, not unlike what we saw in Redding earlier this week, a very localized but very serious, very intense downpour resulting in intense localized flash flooding. And the other issue will be that the severe thunderstorms could increase the wind threat. So the main threat associated with those potentially severe thunderstorms, which again is unusual for California at this scale, unusual, I would even say rare, at the scale that we may see it later tonight into Thursday in some areas in several successive waves, there is the potential for some isolated tornadoes. In fact, I would be somewhat surprised if there were not at least one tornado somewhere in California over the next 72 hours, and there could be several. So there could be a bit of a severe thunderstorm outbreak, and that is, again, not common in this part of the world, and that could affect multiple areas. I'll talk a bit about that as well. Finally, there will be eventually heavy snow in the Sierra Nevada. The snow level dropped a little bit yesterday. We got a little bit of wet slush down to about 6,500 feet or so. Snow levels have risen way back up to 10,000 feet with warm air advection. The temperatures are in the mid 50s right now, for example, in Truckee, pretty high elevation, South Lake Tahoe in the 50s as well. Reno, Carson City area in the 60s right now. So these are really mild, muggy, subtropical air mass. Some of that snow may melt again today up to 10,000 feet, but that snow level will start out high with the storm, up around 10,000 feet, but will crash later in the storm to well below pass level. So it may start out as rain in South Lake Tahoe and even up at the passes on Interstate 80 and Interstate 50, but it will quickly turn over to snow about a third to halfway through the storm and remain as snow in the mountains thereafter. So some very heavy snowfall is likely following a really abysmal start to the snow season, the worst start to the snow season on record. In fact, in most of the central and northern Sierra, will be immediately followed by several feet of snow over the next 48 hours once that initial warm air mass gets eroded out of there. So a lot going on. I'm going to try and keep this session short. Good chance I'll run over the half hour, but I said a half hour, so I'll actually keep it as short as possible since I do, unfortunately, have a lot of other things I got to get to today as well. Okay, so let me go ahead. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that are rolling in now and then go over and share the screen. Again, I know there's a lot of folks joining today. Probably from all around California and elsewhere. If you're enjoying this channel, please do consider subscribing and turning notifications on for these live streams, because otherwise it can be a little bit difficult to know when I schedule them at the last minute, like I did today, and I often do during periods of active or severe weather. Also, a reminder: this channel is sponsored by Reask. Okay, so looking at the questions that are coming in, mostly just comments. Greetings from all over the state. A few places reflecting on the widespread flood watches and wind warnings that are already out. Not surprising here. Lots of folks checking in. So we really do have a good representation from all around the state. I will be curious how this unfolds tomorrow. Ordinarily, I would probably do a live stream tomorrow, by the way, at the peak of the storm in Southern California, but I will be attempting to fly into San Francisco around that time, so I'll be following it from the internet, the social media platforms I usually use. So I'll shell out for the in-flight Wi-Fi on this trip. We'll see how well I can keep track of that for folks in real time. Yeah, one practical consideration tomorrow is it's a major holiday travel day for a lot of folks. It is going to be a genuinely dangerous day to be on the road in Southern California in particular. The daytime hours tomorrow, parts of Northern California are actually going to get a break. In fact, there may even be some sun briefly before the next big storm comes in. But in the LA area, this is going to be a very poorly timed storm, starting really getting worse right around sunrise and continuing for 6 to 8 hours thereafter. So really, most of the daytime tomorrow looks terrible in LA with potentially torrential rainfall, widespread flooding, even in the urban areas, dangerous, even life-threatening flash flooding, debris flows, mudslides in and near the mountains, including the suburbs of LA that are near the mountains, and inland empire communities in a similar situation, and also Central Coast, 101, Santa Barbara corridor, that's going to be potentially a real mess, and a lot of these roads are not going to be passable. They will be flooded or covered in mud and rocks, and that does include some major thoroughfares. So if you really can leave today, instead of driving tomorrow in Southern California, that really would be the better option. Even waiting for the day after would be better, although I realize that for a lot of folks with the holiday, that's not a realistic option. So really leaving early might be the best bet for a lot of people. I know there's going to be a lot of traffic today, but believe it or not, even sitting in LA traffic today might be take less time than trying to wind your way through a flooded network of highways tomorrow. It really just might not be doable for a lot of folks, and certainly will not be a fun, pleasant, or particularly safe drive. There's also some places that are particularly prone to debris flows and flash flooding that you might want to consider spending the night somewhere else, because this is going to pop up really early in the morning. So unless you're going to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning and get out of those super high risk zones early in places where evacuation warnings or orders may be issued preemptively, and I'll be speaking with the city of LA later today to talk a little bit about that. You might consider, if you know you're probably going to be in one of those zones, where you want to stay tonight instead of remaining in those zones, because this will be a high-end event and it's going to start pretty early in the morning tomorrow. The other option is to get up really early, but sometimes it's easier to just be in a safe place before the sun sets, or at least before you go to bed. And again, this is not to say evacuate LA, which is some of the headlines that you're seeing on social media, which is of course ridiculous and not reflective of the geographic diversity of the threat, which is in some places genuinely life-threatening, and in other places is more of an inconvenience. That is certainly true, but there are some places in LA that could be at genuine risk of some dangerous flooding tomorrow, and everyone else is going to be at risk of at least disruptive street flooding, if not a bit more than that. There are some rivers in Southern California, depending on how things go, depending on how much the storm front stalls out, that could actually see their highest levels in years. Certainly very rapid rises, and maybe some actually experiencing some flooding, including in some of those urban areas that have flood channels. This may, in some localized settings, come close to testing those. So we will see how this unfolds. Again, it's not the total volume of water, it's how quickly it's going to fall. It's going to fall very intensely, very suddenly, in a number of places. So still going through the comments here before I start showing some more data. All right, let's see. A lot of folks saying today is calm. Well, yes, today is quite literally by definition the calm before the storm. In fact, it's actually quite mild. A few places may even see record high temperatures today in California, as there is a legitimate warm front, which we don't always see, but it's warm, moist air ahead of the storm. Classic mid-latitude cyclone, a bit of an indicator that the snow levels will start high, that the atmosphere is juicy, and that thunderstorm potential is a bit higher than usual. This is a little bit more like a storm you might see in the central U.S. In spring, rather than one that's particularly common along the west coast in terms of its structure and character. So that's one of the reasons why it's going to be a bit of an interesting one. It's a question about whether I can show the Tahoe snow levels like I did yesterday. Yes, I already have that queued up. I'll show that in just a minute. Question about Christmas Day, or the 25th, which would be Thursday this week. Unfortunately, there is going to be a secondary storm. It won't be as strong as the first in Southern California, though it will bring an additional round of potentially heavy rain and thunderstorms. It could, again, in Northern California, be very intense. In fact, I think the risk of severe thunderstorms may actually be greater with the second round. So with more strong gusty winds and a legitimate chance of actual severe thunderstorms and an isolated tornado risk in Northern California from that second storm, maybe even higher than the first. So it's going to be stormy as well. couple of questions from folks talking about the tornado risk, and I'll talk more about that in some detail, but just to answer some of those questions now. Question about whether it could turn into a, quote, tornado alley situation. So as I've talked about, generally speaking, California tornadoes they share many characteristics structurally with tornadoes that occur in much more energetic and unstable environments like the central U.S., so Tornado Alley. But they are almost categorically weaker. You can have, in the Midwest, at the very worst, a mile-wide tornado with winds of almost 300 miles an hour. That's a pretty horrifying thought. That is not the kind of tornado that you can get with the kind of air mass that will be in California this week, or the kind of air mass that, to my knowledge, in living human history has ever been anywhere near California. So the kinds of tornadoes that we talk about in California are at the lower end of the tornado scale. In fact, most California tornadoes are at the very low end of the scale, EF0, for example, on a scale of EF0 to EF5. Doesn't mean they're not potentially damaging or injurious, but it does mean that these are not the kind of tornadoes, generally speaking, that are going to be building, destroying, or town leveling. Those are generally, we don't have, it's one kind of risk you don't have to worry about by virtue of being in California. We just don't have the level of energy in the atmosphere that's required to produce those. That said, California tornadoes have injured people seriously and have caused extensive damage in the past. And there have been a couple of stronger tornadoes in California history, including a couple in LA County during a similar storm, this one, in the early 1980s. One of those tornadoes actually caused quite a bit of damage in downtown LA and caused serious injuries. So they're rare. They can be a bit stronger. Most of them are on the weekend and aren't that different from experiencing a really strong wind gust from a winter storm. But we could see those too during this event, and so there will be some risk of wind. The tornado risk would be more isolated, but a bit more concentrated and a bit more intense. So most people won't experience a tornado. On the other hand, they are somewhat unusual in California, although maybe not as unusual as some folks might believe. They do happen every single year in California, and the reason why we don't hear more about them is, well, they tend not to be devastating events. So they're more local curiosities, and if you get really unlucky, you get some wind damage at your home. Usually that's the extent of it, but there might be a little bit elevated risk this week in terms of the number. Not necessarily stronger tornadoes, but maybe a higher likelihood that there are at least a few of them, because there will be a large portion of California that is in an environment that is at least somewhat favorable for tornadic development, and that is unusual. Usually, most of California is at zero risk of tornadoes, so a large swath of the state being at even a slight risk cumulatively is actually quite notable, and I would not be entirely surprised if the National Oceanographic and if NOAA Storm Prediction Center, issued some form of severe convective watch, like a severe thunderstorm watch potentially at some point in the next couple of days, which again is rare for California. I don't have any inside knowledge, but I am a meteorologist and I do think about these things, and it is the kind of pattern where I could see that potentially happening. There's only a relative handful of times in history in the last 20 or 30 years when that's happened, so that is notable. All right, let's see here. There's a couple of comments about how the people saying that it looks like the forecast rain for the LA Basin or foothills has significantly backed off from yesterday. Is this true? Essentially, no, it's not true. I don't know exactly where that information might be coming from, but it looks pretty much the same as it did this time yesterday. But again, it is not so much the total amount that I think is of great concern. It is the amount that will fall per hour, and that value is going to be very high even if the total amount is only 2 or 3 inches, which again is a big rain event for LA, although nothing historic. But the hourly and 2 hourly totals of an inch or two are actually the bigger problem, because a lot of that is going to fall all at once, and that is more than the storm drains are going to be able to handle. That is more than some of these flood control conduits may be able to handle, and in particular in the mountains, that leads to flash flood and debris flow risk. And up there, the cumulative amounts will be much, much higher, up in the 10 to 12 inch plus range. couple folks mentioning that the feed is a little bit laggy today. I'm not quite sure why that is. The internet connectivity. Oh, I see. Let's see here. Okay, let me just quickly change one setting here because it is actually becoming a problem. Every time I work with with Comcast to deal with this, it ends up being a bit of a problem. So just bear with me here, and I'm going to just work with this here. Okay, well, the speed is coming back up, so I'll do what I can. There's a limit to the my ability. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my screen, and that also sometimes helps a little bit with these things because occasionally it just needs a little bit of a revamp. All right. So, okay, so what you're seeing is my screen. The first thing that I want to share, and I'll just double check that I'm actually sharing this as expected. Just give me a moment here. Okay, so satellite imagery. This is live, as it always is when I share this kind of stuff on screen. This is a view of the Eastern Pacific from the GOES West satellite. We can now see more clearly the developing storm for tomorrow, the big one that's going to affect LA. Let me redraw that. That's a pretty awkward L. Here's the low pressure system. It's got a nice sort of warm subtropical air in the inflow region. It's got some nice cold air dropping in from behind. So essentially what there is there's a bit of a warm front. It's not super pronounced, but there's kind of a warm front somewhere up here. There's a developing cold front sort of in this vicinity moving forward. So let me redraw that for the sort of future position. So the low right here is here right now, and you can see it developing. Later, it's going to sort of strengthen as it moves up the coast to a position west of the Bay Area. And we're going to continue to see that cold air wrapping in behind, this warm air wrapping up in front. We're going to have essentially a warm front somewhere around here. These are sort of stylized a bit. But my point is, this is a pretty classic, and here's the cold front right here. This is a pretty classic mid-latitude cyclone structure that's developing. And this low pressure system is going to move up the coast, potentially affecting Washington and Oregon with some strong wind as well. But the key here is, well, we can see a few things. We can see the residual subtropical moisture taps. There's a bunch of warm, moist air in this sector. There's enough cold air behind here that this region right here is known as the baroclinic zone, or a region of enhanced baroclinic instability. Essentially means the clash between this cold air mass here and this warm air mass here. So this one is warm and humid, and this one is relatively cold and dry, and they are interacting in this zone here, and this low pressure system is rapidly developing. One of the big uncertainties is just how much will this low pressure deepen as it takes this kind of trajectory. So will it become an extremely deep low or just a moderately deep one? That is really going to affect not so much the flash flood risk in Southern California. That's pretty much locked in. It's not really going to affect the severe thunderstorm risk in this region. That's pretty much locked in as well. But what it's really going to affect is the amount of severe wind gusts that we might see in this region. So from about, I should probably draw that a little bit farther south, from about the Monterey Bay Area northward all the way to the Puget Sound, Seattle region. So this is the zone where we could see potentially stronger than predicted wind gusts, and they're already predicted to be pretty strong. But it's all going to depend on exactly how much this low pressure system strengthens, and that's still a significant question mark, partly because this small system, it's pretty small, geographically speaking. The coarse resolution global models don't really have the resolution to fully resolve what's going on in this region. So the high resolution models are what we would turn to. So the very convection resolving non-hydrostatic models is what they would be called in the meteorological world. But here's the problem. Because I continue to believe, this is my pet peeve, is that a lot of the national high-resolution models have a boundary that cuts off right about here for the United States. And I acknowledge that you have to draw the line somewhere because these are not global models. They're very computationally expensive, and so you have to essentially pick and choose what you're optimizing. But let me just double check and make sure that this is not, the quality is not too crazy here. Let me just double check. Okay, so I unfortunately, folks, I think this is the best I can do right now, so I'm just gonna have to stick with it. Okay, so I was talking about how the boundary on some of these high resolution models is right where the storm is developing. So like, again, the boundary is literally like right here. So this low pressure system is forming here and it's going to move across the boundary. And when I mean the boundary, I mean that the predictive model only exists in this part of the domain. It doesn't, there is no, this is sort of no man's land out here. And so the problem with this is that the storm is developing right along that boundary, right along the edge of where these predictive models, these non-global, these regional predictive models exist. So there can be some strange, let's just call it artifacts. There can be boundary effects when something important is happening right near the edge, because the model has to suddenly develop this system out of the ether rapidly at the boundary and then move it and develop it correctly. So it is the reason why there is so much uncertainty, and I'll show you, as the storm moves up north in this corridor, because it's right at that boundary right now, the models may be, the high resolution models may be overdoing the strengthening of the storm. I hope so, because if they're right, then there's going to be some pretty serious wind gusts in this region. But they also might not be overdoing it because the global models often underestimate the magnitude of strengthening of low pressure systems like this because we know that they can't represent all the processes correctly. So honestly, I don't know exactly what's going to happen in terms of how much this strengthens as it moves north and how much wind it brings to Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. But where there is very little uncertainty is that the flash flood threat here is very high and that there will be severe thunderstorm risk along a lot of the California coast as well as part of the Central Valley. So I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. So just give me a minute here to switch over to the next tab here. Okay, so here's the flood threat. And I'm going to zoom in here. This is via the Pivotal Weather website, but it's actually a product from the official product from NOAA, so they're just replotting it here, but honestly they're replotting it better. And I'm going to zoom in on Southern California because that's the big threat area. You can see Northern California has some low risk of flash flooding, but it's not super remarkable. But Southern California is really where the whole story is, because this is where there is in the entire highly populated Southern California metro area is within either the moderate or the high risk, so either the level 3 out of 4 or level 4 out of 4, top of scale risk for. And let me change the color of my screen brush. Let's go with bright green, lime green. Don't see that on the map anywhere. So it is in particular this region that's outlined in sort of the magenta, the purple, the high risk zone. Now, most folks may or may not be aware of sort of where they are on a map. So just to point out, this is essentially LA County. Again, LA County has the highest risk category running right through the middle of it. And that does include the northern suburbs, the San Fernando Valley, really north of downtown. So anywhere that's in or near the mountains includes the Santa Monica Mountains as well. It also includes the San Bernardino County Mountains, the Inland Empire along them as well, and then all the way west into eastern Ventura County, so the mountains above Ojai. And then the rest of the area, again, moderate risk is still a highly elevated level of risk for the whole region. So this includes essentially all of the populated parts of LA County, all of Ventura County, and as well as all of Orange County and parts parts of San Bernardino, Riverside, and even a little bit of San Diego County. But to be quite honest, San Diego County is probably not going to see too many problems from this storm. San Diego County might actually be one of the least affected counties in all of California from this sequence. So there will be probably a sharp cutoff in rainfall somewhere near this line. It could be a little closer to this, it might be a little closer to this, but it's roughly going to be in that area. But unfortunately, it really does look like LA County, Ventura County, and maybe Santa Barbara County, at least eastern Santa Barbara County, are really going to be in the crosshairs of this. And again, the main reason for this is, as we know, and let me just move this map. Well, actually, this is probably fine. As we know, the transverse ranges run across the mountains of Southern California. Again, I'm not drawing the topographic axis exactly, but they're roughly here. Actually, let me get that so it stays on the map. They're roughly in this region here. I should redraw that. Sorry, one more attempt at redrawing here. It's essentially this purple region, or at least the northern end of this purple region. That's where the transverse ranges are. And this, essentially in this pattern, the problem is we're going to have flow during this pattern that's almost exactly perpendicular to these mountains, with extremely high velocity moist air hitting them in an unstable environment. So these mountains are going to be able to squeeze out a phenomenal amount of water very quickly. But also, and that's something we've seen in previous big storms, but one of the reasons why there's so much concern even in the LA metro area here is that there will be these training lines of showers and very intense thunderstorms that could produce torrential downpours that last an hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours on Wednesday. And this is when the relatively brief but extremely intense periods of rain could produce urban flooding, flash flooding virtually anywhere. That's one big concern. Okay, and so the next thing I'd like to show while I'm here, I guess I will go over to the Storm Prediction Center. And here, the Storm Prediction Center means severe convective storms, so severe thunderstorms. And again, just pointing out, this is today's severe thunderstorm outlook, and already by later tonight, the immediate coast could potentially see some severe thunderstorms. Again, I got to change my drawing color here yet again and bring it up. Yep, I want to bring up the yellow here. Highlighted here, again, all the way from the north coast, including the entire Bay Area, Monterey Bay Area, down to the Central Coast. This is tonight. So this is the severe risk tonight. The main likelihood are very intense rain and strong wind gusts, potentially above 70 miles an hour. Again, those could cause locally much greater damage, but there is a potential for isolated tornadoes. This does include the Bay Area, and so there could actually be some isolated tornado activity. But what I really wanted to show, and that's reflected in this plot, here is the specific tornado risk. And again, the likelihood is low. Essentially, this is described as the likelihood within 30 miles of a point of a tornado occurring, and that's about at 2%. But again, if you aggregate that 2% over a large area, the odds you actually see at least one tornado go up by quite a bit somewhere on this corridor. And again, this is just tonight, with the other hazard essentially being wind, and roughly severe winds in roughly the same area. But I really want to point out tomorrow as being the most interesting period potentially for severe thunderstorms, because this is the broadest part of California that may be affected. Again, different points during the day tomorrow, a good majority of California's population could potentially be at risk of some severe thunderstorms. And again, that's pretty rare because it includes San Francisco, Sacramento, it includes Merced, maybe even down to Fresno, it includes Santa Barbara, it includes Los Angeles. So that, again, is a majority of California's population, I do believe. So a long swath of coastline potentially, as well as tomorrow afternoon parts of the Central Valley. So up here, the severe convective risk is mostly going to be in the early morning hours and then again late Wednesday night. In this part of coastal Southern California, the risk will be during the daytime. So it will actually be while you're awake after sunrise Wednesday morning into early Wednesday afternoon. The risk here in the Central Valley is actually going to be more of an afternoon thunderstorm thing because it's going to get a little bit warmer with even some sunny breaks. So there could be some isolated supercells that develop supercells being self-organizing, rotating thunderstorms that can produce isolated tornadoes in this part of the Central Valley, northern San Joaquin, southern Sacramento Valley tomorrow. And again, that is reflected explicitly in this SPC tornado risk plot, which again, that's now what I'm showing. And again, there's a significant part of California's population under the explicit 2% tornado risk contour. I wouldn't even be too surprised if at some point we actually see an escalation to something more like 5%, which would be pretty rare historically, at least for a portion of the risk area somewhere. So tornado risk, there could even be some larger hailstones with those supercells in the Central Valley. That's less likely along the coast because there's less instability. And again, wind is a threat potentially everywhere. And as we go into day 3, this is Thursday, we see once again thunderstorms possible across a lot of California, but the severe risk is now confined more to the southern and central coast. But once again, these are concerns. So you really need for severe thunderstorms a combination of atmospheric instability. So you need essentially, again, I'm doodling in plan view. If this is height going upward, and this is just the horizontal direction, so just think latitude, longitude. If you have a cumulus cloud that's developing and you have updrafts within it, you need that convective available potential energy to make these updrafts grow aggressively taller and turn this cloud into a giant cumulonimbus cloud that's going to produce that thunderstorm and that heavy precipitation. So that's sort of the thunderstorm fuel component. But to get a stronger storm, you also need, essentially, you need some shear, some wind shear in the atmosphere. So again, in that plan view, again, here is X. I need to keep, actually, here, there we go. Here's like latitude, longitude. Here is height going upward vertically, as you'd expect. What you need is actually winds that increase in strength as you go up. So if each of these lines is sort of illustrative of the strength of the winds, this is illustrative of wind shear. So if the winds get sharply stronger as you go up, you can kind of see how if you have an updraft that starts, it's going to start to tilt over and do something like this. And so if you have a cumulus cloud that develops, it's going to kind of tilt over itself and go like this, and you're going to get that anvil that develops over the thunderstorm. This is going to allow the updraft to occur in a different location than the downdraft, and so it becomes a little bit easier to sustain that severe thunderstorm, and so it can grow taller, it can go stronger, and also this shear, this vertical shear in the atmosphere. So essentially what we see is the strong winds aloft and weaker winds at the surface. That vertical shear also allows for some rotation to occur in the atmosphere in a horizontal sense, because you sort of have what's known as shear velocity or shear horizontal rotation. If you have an updraft that tilts this horizontal shear upward, well, now you have something that's rotation that's tilted in the vertical direction. Just think of these as like corkscrews. Now you have updrafts contributing to spiraling, and you can kind of intuitively understand how if a storm is rotating in a corkscrew fashion, it's going to be more prone to producing rotational phenomena like tornadoes. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but in the context of today's already more than 30-minute long session, that's about all I've got for you for now on that front. So I'm going to close out of some of these to try and... by the way, there's more record warmth today. I mean, look at this. It's just absurd. In fact, let me refresh this. I mean, monthly record highs, daily record highs, you know, Carson City, Reno, random places in the Bay Area, near daily record highs. It's warm everywhere. One thing I'll show before I forget, since I'm rushing through the end of the session as quickly as I can here, here is that snow level plot that someone asked for that I already had queued up. This is the same one. As expected, by the way, snow levels have risen all the way back up to 10 to 12,000 feet in the Sierra. So right now it's like 55 degrees in Truckee. It's nowhere near snow. It's also dry and sunny, actually. So this storm, the warm air is back. But as I mentioned, the snow levels will be falling pretty much continuously from this point moving forward. Here's sort of Lake Tahoe level. So they'll fall to lake level for a while and then even below it by the end of the storm. But the beginning of the storm will still be mostly rain in the Tahoe area. So we will get rain on snow. warm rain on snow that will change eventually over to snow. So this initial period will be slushy and gross and horrible skiing, horrible travel period. Probably both much better skiing during this period, but also going to be going to be hard to travel up there as well, because this could be really heavy snowfall. This could be past closure levels. So I would say either get up there today and hunker down, or wait until probably after the 25th. That would be my advice, because it's going to be, travel will be difficult or impossible at times. But right now, it is actually fine. The roads are probably in better than average shape for December 23rd. But again, snow level's really high right now, gradually falling at the beginning of the storm and then crashing below lake level thereafter. So starting out as rain, even in the mountains, but then transitioning rapidly over to snow, with major travel difficulties likely in the mountains at that point. By the way, one other note about those extremely warm temperatures, and this is just a shout out to the Balanced Weather blog, that I think is a great resource for, sort of provides almost a national perspective that I'm trying to provide a specialized perspective for in the West and in California. But one thing I really wanted to emphasize here was this amazing statistic that Alan brought to my attention. I know it's been warm throughout the West, but and it's this section right here that I'm referring to. Yesterday, on Monday, the overnight low temperature in Salt Lake City was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. 59. Again, Salt Lake City is a high elevation city, so mid-December low temperature of 59 degrees. That was not only a record overnight temperature, but it actually exceeded the daytime high temperature record for the day. So in other words, in Salt Lake City yesterday, the overnight minimum temperature was already warmer than the warmest daytime high temperature that had ever been previously observed on December 22nd. That is an extraordinary breaking of record. And the thing is, it's not that unrepresentative. It wasn't some freak event, but it's just been ridiculously warm, particularly at night, everywhere throughout the West. There's just been no freezes to speak of. So it's just an indication of how remarkable things are right now. Okay, so again, I've got this, I've already showed satellite. I'm going to go through a few models, and then I'm going to take some more questions because there's just so much going on. Okay, so we've got the European model representation of the storm. Here's the most recent update. It shows a developing surface low. As I mentioned, keep an eye on this northwestern upper left corner of the map, showing this system bottoming out at around 983 millibars. So actually, that is a deeper low. Well, actually, no, that's the second system. Here's the first system. It shows, and this is by early this evening, it shows the surface low being west of Cape Mendocino, essentially, which again is making rapid progress. And then later tonight, being west of Eureka, Arcata at 992 millibars, deepening and then actually making it landfall near the Oregon-California border at about a 989 millibar low. So that's pretty low, but nothing extraordinary. Obviously showing, though, a very intense rain event unfolding in Southern California. So again, first along the Central Coast, and then later into LA County and points east, with the secondary system, as I mentioned, moving in on Thursday. But again, keep in mind this 989 millibar low up here. That's one thing I want to do an intermodal comparison. Here's the American model representation of this same system, showing a significantly deeper low. So look at that, 982 as it approaches Eureka, and then this thing is zipping out of there. Man, 6 hours, it's already up by Washington State. This is a significantly stronger low pressure system, which would bring significantly stronger winds to Northern California. And again, though, agreement of this pretty serious rain event. Look at that. I mean, over LA County, that is pretty concerning, stalling out even again. And there's more agreement on the secondary system moving in. But something I wanted to show, though, is a direct comparison with some of the other models. So if we look at the high resolution model, and you can see, by the way, this is what I mean by that boundary being artificially cut out there. Whoops, I clicked the wrong button there. This is what I mean by that button, by that boundary being, let me bring up bright blue or something. You see that here, it's of course not a real discontinuity. We do not live in Discworld, but This is just where the model boundary gets cut off. So you can see how this storm is right by the boundary. So I'm not quite sure what to believe. Do I believe this model where the storm is forming out of the ether right near the boundary with edge effects, or do I believe the global models that are coarser in resolution but don't cut off at the boundary? They already know the storm is down here and they have better contiguity. Well, let's just see how this particular model represents this storm. And as you can see, it really suggests a blockbuster storm. I mean, 973, 970, 968 millibar. This would be a bomb cyclone, and this would produce a widespread damaging wind event along, really from the Monterey Bay Area north along the north coast up into Oregon, and potentially Washington as well. This would be a much more severe windstorm than is currently in the forecast. And honestly, and you can see this thing just sits by the north coast, essentially making landfall at near hurricane strength. This would effectively be a non-tropical hurricane force low. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'll show you what I mean by the magnitude of the sustained wind that's predicted here. I gotta bring up the map here. So look at the units on this. Getting up into the purples. So this is in nautical miles per hour. In knots, 64 knots is getting pretty close to hurricane. In fact, I believe 64 knots is, I'm trying to think, it's 1.1 miles per hour. But this is effectively a hurricane force low, making landfall right along the north coast. Again, that would be sustained winds near hurricane force. Sustained winds around 70, 75 miles an hour, with gusts to 80 or 90 miles an hour. This would be very damaging. And I don't know exactly how realistic this scenario is. I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but we are still seeing, and by the way, I just did the math, that is officially a hurricane force low, because 65 knots is essentially 74 miles an hour, which is the threshold for hurricane. So, this is a pretty big deal. And you can see if we look at the winds above the surface, again, these are not surface winds, these are winds aloft, so don't freak out too much. But these are getting up to around 100 knots or 110 miles an hour, about 5,000 feet above the surface. That would suggest that in the mountains you could get wind gusts above 100 miles an hour with this event if it were to unfold, with wind gusts 70, 80 plus miles an hour, more widespread in the Bay Area and Central Valley. So again, I do not think this is the most likely outcome, but it is something to keep in mind. And I don't think we're really going to have an answer until it kind of happens. This is a classic nowcasting. And you can see what the problem is. Look, this storm just kind of doesn't exist, and then it forms right at the boundary of this high resolution model. Let's look at one other high resolution model, and I haven't even seen this update yet, because this is a brand new one. Let's take a look at what this one does with the winds. This is closer to the global model. So actually this is still a major windstorm from the Bay Area northward to the north coast, but it's a much less major windstorm for the Pacific Northwest, and it's not as extreme as that high resolution rapid refresh model. Again, strong winds expected in Southern California, but I'm not thinking that winds are going to be the big story so much down south of that secondary storm coming in, as I mentioned, on Thursday. But there's one other piece of this that I really want to, and I'm toggling between weather websites because they don't all have the same access to the same information. Here is the maximum wind gust. Actually, let me just illustrate right now what that high resolution weather model was suggesting for maximum wind gusts. And again, these are wind gusts from the high resolution model. You can really see, by the way, the cold front and the warm front here in unusual strength, and you can see, so we have wind gusts that are up in the 85 to 90 mile an hour range as the system moves. In fact, even showing some wind gusts over the open ocean of over 100 miles an hour. Again, I do not think this is the most likely, but in this scenario, if this more extreme scenario were to come to pass, we could see 90 plus mile an hour wind gusts along the immediate north coast, and then more in the Bay Area. They wouldn't be quite as extreme, but we could see widespread gusts of 50 to 60 with potentially gusts in excess of 70 or 80 miles an hour in the more favored places. This would be a damaging windstorm from the San Francisco Central Bay Area, but especially up in Mendocino, Del Norte counties up into southern Oregon. I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but it would be potentially a significant problem. And again, followed up by another significant wind event, at least in the Bay Area, the following night. To look at what this would look like in terms of the simulated radar, for example, I want composite radar here. So let's see if that's an option here. I have a hard deadline to speak with some folks in about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as I can. But here is that representation of the more extreme version of the storm. Essentially, there will not be a really well-defined cold front, by the way, in the Bay Area with this first storm. It's just going to be squall lines of intense but brief showers and thunderstorms and very strong winds. There's going to be lots of breaks in between them. Tomorrow, by the way, daytime in the Bay Area looks like probably the calmest weather for the rest of the week. Daytime hours, there could be some isolated thunderstorms, but most of the area will be clear with lighter winds before, again, this will be the big potential for severe thunderstorms is actually tomorrow night, and there are some individual supercells, structures that kind of show up here. But if we look at this line as it's represented, by the way, this would be early tomorrow morning around sunrise, and we look at Southern California here. This is why there's so much concern over flash flooding. So what we've got is a situation, well, actually, I can't use that drawing tool. So just draw your attention down to Southern California here. I'm having some lagginess once again. You can see this very consolidated band of very heavy precipitation moving slowly across the LA Metro. And this will be mid-morning tomorrow, so right when everyone's probably trying to get out on the road. This is that big problem. If this stalls over LA County, there could be some big-time flooding in that region as well. And we do have, and let me just bring this up as well here. We do have some, and let me let's use the HER model for that. And we'll go back to the 18 Zulu run. So again, seeing these intense showers and thunderstorms. So this will not be, this is going to be in the overnight hours tonight. The Bay Area, you're not going to see a traditional gradual ramp up of the rain followed by a clear cold front. There's going to be a bunch of scattered to numerous showers and thunderstorms, some of which may be severe, and they will contain very strong winds. So the rain will be on and off, but it could be locally torrential. Squally lines, there could be a narrow cold frontal rain band. But again, look at this representation. This is going to be the sort of overnight hours. We see this narrow cold frontal rain band developing squall line with the torrential rainfall across Southern California. This is the big time flood threat. As this moves through this is going to be 6 a.m. California time. So this is going to be moving through Santa Barbara right around 6 a.m. Santa Barbara time, and we'll be approaching LA County right around 8 a.m. So as I mentioned, this is going to be right around when people are trying to get out the door. This is going to be 9 a.m., 10 a.m. The very heavy torrential rain continuing in Southern California as Northern California gets a bit of a break. And that could for much of the day tomorrow into afternoon. You can kind of see this next system organizing with maybe some nasty looking, maybe even severe thunderstorms developing offshore. Also notice in the Central Valley, 2, 3, 4 p.m. tomorrow, these may not look that impressive on this map, but these could be those isolated thunderstorms that can become severe thunderstorms with some tornadic potential tomorrow afternoon. So it'll be an interesting cloud watching day if you're in the Central Valley in particular tomorrow. And then these really nasty looking potential severe thunderstorms moving into the Bay Area as part of the second system beginning early evening tomorrow and continuing well into the overnight hours. In fact, the highest risk of severe thunderstorms might occur right around 2 a.m. local time, so it could be a loud night. So on Christmas Day night, this could be a loud one up in the Bay Area because of some very, very electrical storms. There could even be some tornadoes. This is really one of the more remarkable. I mean, look at that. This does have the hallmarks of the closest thing I've seen to a Northern California severe thunderstorm outbreak in a long time. These systems this week may bear some similarities, by the way, to the 2023 events that brought severe thunderstorms and even some tornadoes to the California coastal region. A lot of wind damage, not so much from large-scale gradient winds, although again, that's possible up along the north coast if that stronger solution comes to pass, but also from these lines of severe thunderstorms. So this will be a fairly dramatic storm. Sometimes people complain about rain shadowing, people complain about the mountains getting all the water. I don't think that's going to be true this time around. And now we see that some of these squall lines will move into the Sierra with blinding snowfall rates on, this would be, I guess this is Christmas Day. So we've got, this is the 25th in the morning, snowfall rates of like 3 inches per hour. You can't drive in that. That's snow that's accumulating way faster than it can be plowed or even packed down into hardpack on the roadways. So it really is just going to be difficult to impossible travel up here in the mountains as we go into the 25th, just because the snowfall rates will ironically be so incredibly heavy in places that have seen almost no snow so far this season. And again, these lines, the big issue here, these lines over the Bay Area as we get into the 25th, well, actually, let me bring that back up. It just went away. Sorry. These won't produce widespread heavy rain across the Bay Area like a really strong cold front might, but the challenge here is that soils are now going to be saturated. And if there is a local area, say the Santa Cruz Mountains, where one of these lines sets up and trains over for an hour or two at once, there could be isolated but serious flash flooding in some of these areas, much like there was up in Redding. Was that 2 days ago, I believe. Same thing is true in Southern California. Even though this will no longer be the main flood threat, is going to be tomorrow, not on Thursday. If there is a strong thunderstorm that trains over a previously flooded area, there could be serious flash flooding or debris flows again all the way into Thursday or Friday. So that is then going to be the pattern. This is a very active pattern. Severe thunderstorms possible along much of the California coast. So I am going to go back to no longer share my screen because I do need to wrap this up as quickly as I can here. Depending on how things go, it is possible I'll try and squeeze in a very brief live stream at some point late tonight or tomorrow. It's unlikely, just due to travel and other practical implications, but you never know. Maybe you'll see me in an airport or something for 10 minutes if things are particularly serious. That is, I guess, an option potentially. But I'm going to quickly take these questions in 3 to 4 minutes as fast as they can, and then I got to run on and speak with the folks at the city of LA about this storm because there is considerable concern. Okay. A lot of comments. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, obviously. I'm not going to be able to answer specific questions about specific areas at this point, except to say, generally speaking, there's most uncertainty about the winds in Northern California. They look like they will be widespread, windy, gusty for sure, and there is a slight chance of a highly damaging windstorm that is worse than the current forecast suggests. So it is something to be prepared for from about the San Francisco Bay Area northward. There could be major coastal infrastructure problems. We've seen issues with the piers and the coastal infrastructure in places like Santa Cruz. This is definitely a scenario where that could occur again. Okay, just continuing to go through the comments here. Thanks for joining in. For those latecomers, again, these sessions are always recorded. You can watch the full one after the fact, and I do encourage folks to subscribe and to turn notifications on if you want to be notified if and when I do go live on very short notice. And this is exactly the kind of week where that might happen. Just looking for some last minute questions here. Question, is this the arc storm? No, because that would be considerably worse. So all of the superlatives used today, I'd be using them much more aggressively in that kind of scenario, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be life-threatening flash flooding in Southern California tomorrow in particular, as well as some of the other risks that I mentioned. So this is sort of difficult in the social media era. There's a lot of pressure to say everything is either the worst thing that's ever happened or that it's a complete non-issue, whereas in cases like this, where it is a real issue, a significant one, maybe even historically notable, but not necessarily the worst thing that's plausible. And so there's a lot of space in between there that we need to be able to navigate. And this is one of those in-betweeners. But this is not your ordinary run-of-the-mill storm. This is a potentially very high impact and even dangerous event, particularly occurring as it is during a major travel week, but even independent of that. All right, a little bit of off-topic stuff earlier, but fortunately, most of it is staying on track. So thanks for that, folks. Okay. Yes, as mentioned, there's a couple folks up in northwestern California saying the local weather folks are saying to expect potentially 80 to 100 mile an hour gusts. Again, I think that is at the upper edge of what is plausible, but in this particular scenario, I don't think we can fully rule them out for the regions I just described. So I tend to think that the real world, some of these high resolution models are suffering from that boundary predictive value problem, so maybe aren't 100% reliable, but this is the kind of pattern where that could potentially arise. So it would be wise to prepare for the potential for winds to be stronger than you've seen in a long time in that part of the state in particular, even though the most likely outcome is a very windy event that will still cause power outages and cause trees to fall, but won't be quite as damaging on a widespread basis. Although that, again, 20 or 30% chance that happens, and that's not a small possibility. That is something worthy of preparing for. If you knew that there were a 20% chance of 90 or 100 mile an hour wind gusts along the northwestern coast, even if that weren't the most likely outcome, you might do things a bit differently than if you thought there were only going to be 60 mile an hour gusts, for example, which happen essentially every year up there. Okay, folks, I gotta go. Again, as I mentioned, I will be traveling tomorrow. I'll do my best. If you can follow, I'm always going to be on Blue Sky and X or Twitter, the Weather West blog. I don't necessarily update the blog post, but check out the comments section. There's a lively community there. And I may go live as needed and as I can tomorrow from the airport or something if the Wi-Fi allows me to get at least a little bit of a signal there. So thank you folks, and I'll see you next time.